Hello, everyone, to those of you who are here so far. I'm Dr. James Wood. I'm a researcher and administrator at the Center for Transportation Equity, Decisions, and Dollars, University Transportation Center based at the University of Texas at Arlington. And I'm here today to talk about dockless bike share regulations. Very colorful story of a research project that my students and I worked on for most of the past year. A lot of those of you who are joining us are from local governments who have no doubt seen in some form or another the coverage of dockless bike share, the citizen protests and controversies about who owns them, who manages them, and how they can be safely and reasonably regulated in an environment that, as we'll see, didn't really have too many rules on this going backward. So I'll give it just a little bit more time to let a few more people join. And we have quite a packed house today, I'm pleased to say, and I hope I can answer your questions. Toward the end, we'll have a Q&A period where it'll allow you to type in questions. I'll read the questions aloud, answer them as best I can. If I'm not able to get to your question, feel free to email me at james.wood@uta.edu, and I'll provide that again toward the end. But I'm hoping to have plenty of time for conversation, at least such as it is on a Zoom webinar, because this is a really colorful topic. I've gotten a lot of questions over the last few weeks about how cities can regulate bike share. People are really hoping to get some answers and some ideas out of this, so I hope I can help with that. Okay, hopefully people are able to hear me again. Sorry about that, a little technical problem. So I can start with a little bit of history of bike share programs. It's surprisingly bizarre history. Some of the first structured bike share programs came about in Amsterdam, of course, the world capital of bike share and interesting ideas, in the 1960s, and was actually sort of a quasi-anarchist movement against pollution. And you can see in the picture there, one of its early celebrity supporters were John Lennon and Yoko Ono. And they were called Provo bikes. They were just put out as sort of guerrilla activism on the streets. The city government wasn't involved. The police weren't informed. Most of them were confiscated either by police or in many cases by citizens and celebrities and people who just thought the bikes were free to take home. The concept was really kind of alien back then. But the idea stuck around Europe, and then through the late 1990s, they brought it back in some French cities and then again through Amsterdam. But as many of you know, up until a few years ago, when it came back, it was the docked bike share, the traditional kind with fixed stations and sort of a first generation payment model. and it really dominated on cost and technology grounds. But we're here specifically to talk about the dockless phenomenon, these new bikes that have really only been around in their current form for a few years. So we tracked the resurgence back to about 5 years ago. They started coming back with this new investment from the venture capital, especially in this economy. So there's also the growth in apps. You can now use an app to have multiple different dockless bike share providers linked to one customer, to one account, and it makes it much easier. The cost to manage one of these programs is much lower than it was just a few years ago. So it's allowed for some pretty rapid growth. Dockless systems are very flexible compared to the docked ones. There's no real input, for better or worse, from the community as to where docked stations need to go. These bikes can be just parked almost anywhere, which is convenient for the customer, maybe not always convenient for the city. Again, a lot of investment from the private sector. Those older docked bike share programs had a lot more involvement from the public sector, the government, but these dockless programs had a lot less overt involvement from city government at the start, which caused some issues. I'm sure a lot of you have seen images like these. Dockless bike share, fairly, unfairly, what have you, has an image problem in a lot of communities, including where I live, Dallas-Fort Worth. It has this public image and public controversy of the bicycles being oversupplied, not very well managed on the ground. They pile up in messes. They're chained to trees or benches. The management of them is not always perceived to be very proactive. The photo on the left is a city in China, which is really where a lot of the current dockless bike share programs developed. The image on the right is Dallas, which, again, images like this, they don't tell the whole story of dockless bike share, but it fuels a lot of the citizen activism, the controversy about these programs and the so-called negative impacts, negative externalities, and fuels a lot of the political pressure to regulate them, to find some way to do something about them. So with our little project, we started out with a few sort of bullet point premises and went from there. And we reasoned that with docked bike share, for example, City Bike in New York City, they had fixed stations. They knew where the bikes were going to be parked. The city and the operator and the sponsor, there was a formal, robust agreement. So there wasn't much of a need at the time to have a complicated set of ordinances in place or permit regulations in place, because it was usually one provider with docks where everybody knew where they were. Dockless bike share, on the other hand, operates in most places without a partnership with the city or a contract in place. Cities have to set the rules after the fact, after the bicycles are already on the ground, which makes it much more complicated and speeds up the issue. And we reason cities need some guidance on how best to do this. We look through the literature, and there have recently been a few guidebooks to come out and a little bit of help, but it seems like overall the more people we talk to, the more they said, we need some ideas, we need some specific solutions. So we wanted to contribute to that conversation. There's also the timeliness issue. These bikes appeared in most places without much warning. A lot of places we talked to, no warning at all. They just were dropped off. And so cities didn't have much chance to set guidelines or try to balance them by neighborhood or even inform citizens and neighborhood people that these bikes were coming. They just appeared. So dockless bike share is separate from what we used to think of for bike share. It's different in so many ways, and it requires a different kind of rules. But best practices, again, are still being established, still hard to come by. So we don't know much about where the rules are being written, and if they are being written at all. And then the impacts of this sort of Wild West environment. If in many places there are no rules in place, but the bicycles are there, what does that mean for safety, for equity, for infrastructure planning? And where does that leave citizens and cities? So we have 3 questions. I promise we'll get to some good results here in a bit, but the questions were, first, how are these bike share programs regulated in America's largest cities? 2, what specific issues are covered by these regulations. For example, safety, equity, parking restrictions. How deep into the process do the regulations go? And third, how do those regulations compare across regions and across the United States? Is there a pattern? Are there cities that are sort of leading the way, cities that can be examples for everyone else? We had a two-part study. It was quite colorful to go through. It was in phases. It was ultimately what we call a mixed methods approach, a little bit with numbers, a little bit with interviews and personal opinions of things. To start with, we wanted to look at the largest U.S. cities by population, reasoning that that's where a lot of the bike share programs started out, so we followed that. We started out with 55 cities out of 60 of the largest that had active bike share programs. Of those 55, we found that 25 at the time had rules in place. The other 30 did not. They had bikes on the streets, but they hadn't finalized their regulations yet. And taking that list, we borrowed a rubric from someone who had done a very small foundational study. It's interesting, but it wasn't quite as national scale as we were looking at. And they had a rubric that had 4 categories and a total of 20 discrete little factors. And they were in the categories of safety, operations, ethics, and fleet management. Essentially, you put an ordinance through this rubric to test it on those 4 categories. And you assign them a grade based on how robust the language is, if the language is even present. In a lot of these ordinances, as you might imagine, maybe there's not so much language devoted to ethics as there might be to safety. But we were able to grade them based on not just whether they had an ordinance in place, but how detailed was it, how helpful was it. And then we put them on what we call a spectrum of regulation, comparing tightly regulated systems with cities that had very limited rules in place. And after that point, we also did some follow-up interviews with city regulators and elected officials in especially interesting cities. And by interesting, I mean cities that scored very high or very low on the spectrum, just to sort of get their story and to figure out why did they act the way they did, and what are the impacts, what are the political consequences of the rules that they do have in place. And it's a little small to see here. I apologize for that. It's a lot of information crammed onto one slide. But at the time of the cities that had an ordinance in place, they're listed here, 25 of them, we scored them based on the robustness and overall appropriateness of their regulations that were in place. The highest scoring cities were not exactly what we expected based on our existing knowledge of bike-friendly cities, so to speak. The highest scoring cities were Fort Lauderdale, Florida, and St. Louis, Missouri, also Seattle. Some cities that weren't on this list that at the time were still sort of developing their policies and may still be working through. Los Angeles is not here, Portland, New York City. So some of those cities, have since evolved a little bit farther in this process, but still it's interesting to see which cities were sort of leading the way with really dense, robust ordinances. And it's broken out by category. So for example, a category like this last one here, gamification is what they called it, which is where within somebody's app for their bike share program, you can work with the bike share provider to have some sort of incentive to reward riders for good behavior. It's a very specific concept, and as a result, really almost no cities had that concept built into their system. Also things like multilingual services. A few cities, Seattle, St. Louis, had that written in their regulations that they required multilingual. But for the most part, it was not included, it was not factored in. A lot of what was there was clustered into a few areas of legal liability, safety liability, things to indemnify the city against lawsuits, accidents, things of that nature. Equity was not very well covered. There wasn't much on safety either. Turns out in many places, the helmet laws for shared use bicycles, there's a surprisingly colorful literature on helmet laws and whether they encourage or discourage bike share usage. The consensus seems to be if you require people to use a helmet to use bike share, they won't bother using bike share. It's a deterrent. So I can break these down a little bit more detail in the following slides. So we took those same cities and put them on a spectrum here to see that really only a few of the cities had a robust or a mature regulatory framework, as we called it. A slightly higher number had something sort of in the middle, but the largest number in the group, their regulation was in place or about to be in place, but it was very limited. And it was usually limited just to legal issues, to indemnify the city against injuries and collisions, which was a surprising result. We assumed or we thought that ordinances might cover issues of equity and geographic service and multilingual issues or options for non-smartphone users. But they didn't often come through with that. So the ordinances that we were able to find were often pretty slim, pretty basic, and maybe can be built upon in the future. So there was a little bit of clustering, but not as much as we were expecting. We found that a lot of places didn't really have an ordinance in place. 30 out of 55 cities didn't have one either in process or in place, but they had active programs. And that was the first question we asked them when we got around to the interviews was, how can you have one without the other, and is that ever going to change? And in a lot of these places, we found that there's no formal relationship between the city government and these operators. They know the operators, the names of the companies, because they can read them on the bicycle. But in a lot of places, the operator is in another country, on another continent. It's someone they've never met, they have no relationship with. For example, here in Dallas, there was controversy with some of the dockless operators, and they tried to get in touch with one of the operators in particular to say, please get a handle on the situation. It's negative media coverage. We really need to work with you on this. And for weeks and weeks, they were unable to get in touch with anyone, even on the other end of an email or a phone call. It was very difficult to coordinate services with them. And APA and NACTO have both said this is an issue that needs more attention. They've published some guidebooks and some materials on it, but it's sort of being left out of the discussion, especially now as we move into e-scooters as personal mobility instead of dockless bike share. Dockless is sort of fading out and being replaced with e-scooters, but there's still this push at some levels to have guidance out there, to have information out there for people. So absent that solid, easily available guidance, city governments have to improvise and do the best they can with the material they have. So again, we found that where the regulations were in place, which again was in less than half the cities, the language was dominated by legal issues and insurance liability, things to protect against lawsuits for the most part. Issues of safety, helmet usage, either riding on the sidewalk, not riding on the sidewalk, different places had different rules. They were either vague or simply not there. And written ordinances also didn't have much language at all about ADA compliance, which can be a difficult circle to square as to, should a dockless provider be compelled to offer an ADA accessible bike share option? And if so, what would that look like? What would it cost? It's complex, but we found that there wasn't much language in place to even consider such an option. Also, geographic equity. So language stipulating that a certain number of dockless bikes placed in specific neighborhoods where maybe they're lower income, maybe they're college populations or people who might most directly benefit from a bike share program. Cities could do that if they chose to, if they felt it would achieve certain goals, but equity wasn't really addressed in the language either. Issues of income, for lower income riders, for example, offering a payment system for people who don't use a smartphone or who don't use a credit card. Docked bikeshare didn't have that problem. You could, in some places, you could walk up and put coins or cash into a machine and rent a bicycle. But with dockless, you pretty much have to have a smartphone and you have to have credit cards linked to it to pay for it. So ultimately, the formal language, formal language was rare on this topic. And if it, not necessarily rare, let's say it was less common than we expected. And because there are so many changes going on as the transition from dockless bikeshare into e-scooters or hoverboards, other forms of technology, a lot of these places may just leave it behind. They may just move on to the next personal mobility option. So that part is sort of the open question for this research. And when we talked to some people, we wanted to specifically ask, how is it working in your city and why is it working the way it is? We got a lot of very colorful stories from this process. Interviews are always wonderful. And we would ask, you know, why haven't these things developed, or are you developing a policy or an ordinance? And if they said no, we would say, why not? And of course, they would point to the fact that it's a new concept. You know, they've got their hands full with bike lanes, with sidewalks, with managing all the multimodal transportation options they already have, and now something else has been added to it, which just makes it that much more complicated. And also, in a lot of places, they pointed out that for those of us who go to planning school, in many places, there's maybe, if you're lucky, one class on bike ped planning. So it's a new concept at the professional level, so that there's not as much staff expertise on this as they would like to have. And as a result of that expertise issue, a lot of places have, and it's really interesting that they've done this, they've started to sort of outsource parts of their bicycle planning or bike ped planning to these citizen task forces, to nonprofits, for example, a cycling coalition in many places, like in cities like Portland, San Francisco, Philadelphia, the citizen cycling groups are very powerful, very vocal, and they're evidently quite happy to help out. But the issue is they have the knowledge for bike share planning, and they can help, you know, set the policies, they can help write the book, so to speak, but they themselves aren't regulators. They're not the city government. They can't give people tickets or regulate the permit process. So for them, they have expertise, but they don't have the authority that the city might want to give them to just sort of hand off this process entirely. They did say that despite the problems, they like the idea of bike share in many places because it makes these issues more visible and more tangible to voters, that they see more bicycles on the road, and when they go, maybe if they go as a tourist to Washington, D.C. or New York City, they maybe don't ride a bike at home, but when they're in this new place, maybe they ride a bike share bike for a day or two. And then when they go back home, maybe they're a little more attuned to, in many places, how difficult it is to be a cyclist in the city and how dangerous it can feel if you don't have protected infrastructure. So they felt that despite the slipperiness of the issue, that it's ultimately, over the long term, good politically. And then they would defend the infrastructure as a priority. They would say our priority, our goal is to build more infrastructure, build more protected lanes, and to fight for more funding for that, and then maybe talk about the rules later. That at this point there's so much pent-up demand just to have a safe place to ride a bike so that people don't have to ride in a city park or on a sidewalk just to stay alive, that once they get past that point, then maybe there'd be more of an appetite for setting rules and setting permit regulations. And also, again, at the time, a lot of the dockless bike share was being phased out and replaced with e-scooters, which are now all over the place as well, and there's plenty of colorful news stories about them. So maybe regulating one is not as important as regulating the other, but really they're in many ways quite similar. I would think they could do both. one thing that came up a lot, and I'd like to depict a graphic here, is when you seek to regulate something like this, we found that different cities tried different models to do so, and they came out and advised one specific way. So you have the permit process, and then you have contracts, and then you have ordinances. And as you can see, they each have advantages and disadvantages, but what we found when we talked to people was that in the cities where they had, first of all, the cities that were happiest were those with a contract with only one bike share provider, because they only had to deal with one entity. And when you write a contract, you can put almost anything you want in the contract as long as the other person's willing to sign it. And it's a nice, stable relationship for them. And if you do that, if you have an exclusivity agreement, you don't need an ordinance. But it has downsides that if you, for example, if the relationship sours, if they're not performing, you may be stuck with them for a long time. It's difficult to get out of these contracts. City ordinances, they're bold and powerful. If you have an ordinance in place, you can allow law enforcement to issue citations for breaking the ordinance. But the downside with those is that they're time consuming to draft and pass. And once they're written, if you want to amend them, again, it's also time consuming and difficult to do that. So the category here that's left, permit regulations, we also had a lot of communities tell us they would recommend to other people, other cities, that the permit model works best, which is where a city department writes up their list of permit regulations. It can be as specific or as vague or as detailed as you like. And in most places, it's up to the staff to set their own regulations. They can pull something out, they can add something in quite easily without needing the political deliberation process. It's done at the staff level usually, so changes are pretty quick. But then again, that requires staff commitment. You have to have people willing to, work the permit desk in the planning office, which is already quite a busy place. And you have to monitor the issues. You have to be willing to pull a permit if somebody is not meeting the obligations. So it requires a lot of administration. So it has its downsides too. But generally, the people who were happiest, as I said, they either have a contract with one person and they're very happy, or they love the permit process because they can change it very quickly. They can manage it easily without a whole lot of red tape. So getting into results you can use, information from the study. So we found that the regulations are really variable. It's not like you can go 2 towns over and they'll be guaranteed to have good rules in place you can use. Some places have very lengthy, detailed systems, but most places it's much more basic and straightforward. We found that local activism, really across the country, not just in the places where you would expect bike ped issues to be at the forefront, all over the country, cycling activists are leading the charge here, leading the passion here. So we also found that the city planners in most of the places we talked to and read about, they're really eager to fold those activists into the process because they bring expertise and they bring passion, and it's really quite helpful to the process. They really prefer to stick to the infrastructure issue. That's their main focus, is putting down bike lanes, and especially protected bike lanes, to make people feel safe. The reasoning is if they don't feel safe enough to ride, then they won't ride either a shared bike or their own bicycle. So they'd rather have the infrastructure in place first and boost ridership that way. The cities that had one provider or a small number with a contract, they seem to be happy than in the cities that had many providers operating at the same time. The issue is that what works for one place may not always work for another. So the city has to decide for themselves what a good program would look like. Would they be happy with one operator, or would they be happy with a carefully regulated but colorful ecosystem of many operators? The issue that came up at the end of this research, it was kind of poorly timed, sadly, is that dockless started to fade away. It had kind of a bubble. It's still there in many places, but it's nowhere near as big as it was a few months ago. But this personal mobility revolution, this using your app to book a ride on an electric scooter, on a Vespa, or what have you, it seems like it's going to be a permanent thing, even if the modes themselves change. We're doing follow-up work on e-scooters. We're actually wrapping that project up now. And then it's a similar structure, but we're looking back at the same cities again to say, are they doing e-scooter regulations differently than bike share? And is it the same sort of thing, or are the attitudes different? And also long-term infrastructure change. There's a scholar who visits UT Arlington every so often, and whenever we use the word bike ped, the phrase bike ped, she stops us and says, you need to separate those two. Stop teaching your students that bicyclists and pedestrians go together, because they often don't. And it's at their peril if you mix them too often and too readily. So what will the infrastructure adaptation look like? Will e-scooters have separate lanes from bike share? Will they ride in mixed traffic? We don't quite know yet, but we're watching it happen. And there's also the role of venture capital in all of this. Most of these programs, they started out funded by venture capital groups, mostly from the tech sector. Now a lot of the companies have been bought up by TNCs. Uber owns a bike share provider and also an e-scooter provider, so does Lyft. The Ford Motor Company owns one. So it's a question of how is their involvement changing the situation. And also equity and equal access. We would try to bring it up as often as we could because that's a key part of our research agenda, but it was hard to sort of find that written down in the ordinances, in the regulation, and to encourage people to consider equity issues when they're making these plans so that everyone has access to this, old and young and people with disabilities, recent immigrants, not just the college students that they market a lot of these things to, but people of all ages and abilities. So getting into the advice, the promised advice, and starting in general, it'll get more specific. In general, even if this specific mode goes away, cities will face issues like this going forward. These issues of app-based personal transportation seem to be like they're here to stay, and I'm sure you've seen that in many communities. And we found that a lot of the crisis came about because there was an issue of unpreparedness, or they were just sort of surprised by this because it sprang up virtually overnight in a lot of places. And that can not always be, avoided. Sometimes planners just have to face things as best they can. But it's important that when you do seek to regulate these things or come up with either a contract or permit regulations, to let your community's vision sort of set the tone. That in some of these places, the political climate wouldn't allow for one company to dominate. They would want multiple competitors and sort of a free market attitude. And also in this environment, because there's no one textbook of what you must do, what you should do, the upside to that is that you're free to do what works for you. You can borrow the best ideas from everybody. And in talking to people, reading people, although we mostly evaluated ordinances, we also did look at permit regulations where we could find them. And it just seemed that the consensus across the board was that contracts and or permit regulations seemed to work better, and staff seemed to appreciate them and felt that they led to better outcomes than the ordinance process, just because it's so time consuming and it involves so many steps and so much protocol. They felt it was much more urgent than that, so they went with contracts or permit regulations. They also recommended, and as I'm sure we've heard many times, to take personal mobility as a growing and permanent part of the urban planning process. That, as we know, it's not just cars, it's not just transit, it's also pedestrians and cyclists and scooter users. And we need to invest at our level, for example, in educating future planners, having more coursework and textbooks and materials, because there's a big information gap out there, and these things are there, and we need to know how to manage them safely and fairly. And the best way to do that is to make it a permanent part of the urban planning conversation. And if you haven't already, get to know your local cycling activists. They're wonderful people. I've gotten to know a lot of them over the past 2 years, and they're the fearless people who will ride their bike on a busy 6-lane road and a day it's 95 degrees outside. They'll ride with or without a bike lane. They know which parts of your community are safe for biking and which are just beyond dangerous. They're the first people to know about little things like this and that. And also they do a lot of educational outreach to bring more people onto bicycles as a means of transportation. So it's a great way to gain education and also gain sort of an entree into this community of people. And a lot of those cities that had a really good, robust ordinance or regulation in place with very detailed information, they got that information by working with their cycling nonprofits to sort of share that information and share those goals. Some more specific advice. One thing that we've been sharing with people, my team, we call it the Humane Society model, where it's not a typical outsourcing model, but for a community that wants to set up regulations and enforce them somehow for bike share, for e-scooters, rather than just quote unquote outsource it to a private group or to a nonprofit, structure it sort of the way many communities do with the Humane Society with their animal shelters, where rather than have an animal control department that is staffed by law enforcement or its own department, maybe you have some hybrid model where the physical structure and the day-to-day operation is handled by a nonprofit that knows these issues, that is passionate about them, and can leverage some fundraising, so that maybe, as for example, a cycling nonprofit, maybe they can be the ones to work the front desk and issue the permits for bike share, and they can also monitor the programs, because in a lot of these places they know more about the day-to-day operations of bike share than city people or law enforcement do. And it's a way to let that expertise sort of fill in the knowledge gaps and make sure that these programs are managed fairly and effectively. Next, it's really critical. In several cities, we saw that they took a long time to address a problem, to sort of kick out a bad actor, so to speak. And it helps if you're, as with many other things, quick to reward good actors and quick to punish the bad ones. That can help with the media attention, with the citizen activism from people wishing to just ban bike share entirely, to be quick and responsive, to show that you as a government are aware of these issues and you're doing what you can to enforce the rules, because it's not the Wild West. You're an American or a Canadian city, and you have those regulatory powers as best you can. I got a lot of questions over the past week about regional planning. How can cities in a metro area, and how can you, coordinate across state lines, across county lines, provincial lines? And this can be done regionally, as with many other things. It just requires a degree of understanding and a shared commitment to it. So it can be done, but a regional approach is a really interesting idea, and hopefully more places will go for that. We didn't find much of that in our research. In fact, we found only one region that did that. The Phoenix area has done a lot of regional coordination. But we think that this visibility of what's here today, as those city officials said, can grow the long-range planning. Keep the bikes out there, keep people talking about it, hopefully in good ways. And because we think they're right, that if people see the bikes and ride them, they'll be more likely to take them seriously and care about them. So there are a few questions. Be happy to take those and do the conversation from that part. One moment. Okay. So I see, I guess, the first one is, did we encounter e-scooter regulations but no dockless bike share regulations? And are the requirements similar? So not as many, no. I don't think at the time, I don't think we found any e-scooter regulations. And a lot of the searching was done I'd say 9-10 months ago, around the time e-scooters were first coming about. But we did notice since then that the response to e-scooters is generally much more aggressive. There are a lot of communities that immediately banned e-scooters, or they wrote a law very quickly. They jumped on the e-scooter regulation much faster, much more aggressively than they did with bikeshare. With bikeshare, we didn't really see communities that banned them a week after they showed up, but with e-scooters, we saw several places, usually smaller suburban areas, that would ban them overnight just to get rid of them, because until they or their state government could regulate them. A key difference there when we would ask a little bit about it was that e-scooters in most places, because they're a motorized vehicle, most states regulate motorized vehicles at the state level. So in some communities, they would just issue a ban, almost like an injunction, until their state government could clean it up. And then it was phrased as a temporary ban. But we did notice that cities are much more attuned to e-scooters than they were to bike share. And it may be partially related to this, that they don't want to get caught twice. So this time they're being extra careful with e-scooters. Next question, what were the top 2 or 3 issues that city government and or citizens worry or complain about with regards to these programs, and some common solutions to them? The top issues that cities complained about seemed to be that there was a poor or almost non-existent relationship with the providers. That was the main issue they saw, was that first they didn't get any warning that these things were coming, and when they were here on city streets, it was very difficult to communicate with them if there was an issue, to call and ask for help or notify them of legal action. In some cases, it's difficult to even serve them with a subpoena if they don't have a proper mailing address, even if you're suing them. So that was a big issue that came up a lot, was just there's just no communication, no coordination between them, and it's hard to nail it down at that point. Also, another issue is the lack of education. That, for example, with an e-scooter or with a rented scooter, the bigger full-size ones, there's an education component. Riders are required to watch little videos and check that they agree to do certain things for the name of safety. But with bike share, there's usually not rules like that or education like that. So it was just assumed that the people who rented the dockless bikes would know not to tie it to a tree when they were done, or not to tie it to a park bench when they were done. But of course, in many visible cases, that doesn't happen. Some of the dockless bikes get thrown into rivers or thrown off of highway overpasses. There's a lot of vandalism and theft that goes on with them. And some of that could be blamed on lack of quote-unquote rider education. A lot of it's just the nature of these small mobile objects. You know, e-scooters, you can pick up an e-scooter and throw it quite easily. Same with a bicycle. So they had an issue with that, and also the media coverage didn't help. In a lot of places, they felt that the controversy of these bikes being thrown off of bridges, being left, you know, blocking disabled access spots, things like that, that sort of puts extra pressure on the city to act in haste and to solve this problem quickly, when they'd much rather take a little bit of time and put some thought into it. But it's hard to do that when you've got pressure from the citizens to act on it. And I guess the next question, similar to that, maybe why are dockless systems on the decline? And the cities certainly didn't know much about it, so we reached out to a few of the companies, and the companies had different explanations for it, depending on who we spoke to. It was generally that e-scooters can charge a higher per minute or per user fee. They're more profitable than dockless bike share bikes. In many places, dockless bikes, the operating costs are quite low, but they just weren't as popular. And they see e-scooters as more fun, and they're more profitable, but you can charge more for them, and people will use them longer, maybe take longer trips. So they're on the decline mainly for financial reasons. it's easier. It's also, it reduces overhead a little bit because rather than have somebody who has to rebalance large dockless bicycles with a pickup truck, it's much easier and quicker to rebalance little electric scooters by hand every night. So usually financial reasons. They say they have market research on this, but they never shared any of it with us. Cities were quite baffled by it because cities seem to prefer bicycles because they're maybe a little sturdier than the e-scooters. E-scooters injuries seem to be much more severe, but the companies seem to have mostly financial reasons for making the change, and also demographics. They believe that younger people are much more active as e-scooter users than they would ever be as bicyclists. So they felt that the long-term financial goal was to get these electric motored scooters. Next question, was there a common impetus for cities that implemented regulation, i.e. collisions and accidents? Not as much as we thought there might have been. There were a few cities that had a lot of really documented high-profile accidents and even a few fatalities. But those cities that had a fatality mentioned in the media, it didn't seem to hasten their attitude for regulation. It didn't seem to motivate them to change. In one of the, here in Dallas, for example, near Arlington, a lot of what pushed the issue was the high visibility of vandalism related to the bicycles, that they were being thrown into streams and thrown onto playgrounds and destroying city property, and it became a political hot potato. So in one city, it's the politics of damaging playgrounds, and in another city, you would assume that maybe injuries would move the political needle, but we didn't see much of a pattern. The only pattern we seemed to be seeing was that media attention moves things much greater than statistics on injuries or financial issues. So if there was a pattern, I guess you could say it's that. Media coverage and controversy moves political decisions. Of our interviews of the 55 cities, how many of those were in response to the drop and run vendors, and how many actually sought out having a dockless share program? Actually, of the cities we talked to, none sought out a dockless program. In most cases, I'd say, off the top of my head, I'd say about 90 to 95% were the drop and run cities, and where they had no contact whatsoever. The other 5%, they were drop and run, but they had some notice ahead of time. And it was usually where a neighboring city, maybe the core city in their metro area, the bikes just appeared one day. And then a month later, a major suburb gets an email or phone call saying, hey, by the way, next week, we're going to drop off another 500 bikes in your community. So they received a little bit of notice, but no, we didn't encounter any cities that I can recall that deliberately sought out a dockless program. They came to them. Next question, what permits are in place to deal with dockless bikes blocking a sidewalk when parked? So the rules on that, first of all, sidewalk obstruction is in virtually every city in the US and probably in Canada as well, is an actionable item. You can be cited for that, for blocking a sidewalk with almost anything. But specifically for bike share, that didn't come up as often as we expected it to. That there weren't many rules in many cities that would punish the provider, if the bike share provider, if their bicycles blocked a sidewalk. And we believe it's because the city prefers to issue a ticket to the rider who chooses to block the sidewalk. But that is a very common feeling about dockless bike share, and a criticism of it is that it blocks the sidewalk, especially when 5 or 6 of them are sort of clumped together. Next question, has anyone had success making a bike group stay? Yes, there have been in some cases where they are able to build a relationship. It takes certainly time and certain circumstances, but yeah, if you're able to get one of the providers who answers their letters, who's willing to meet with you and meet with your stakeholders, you can build a relationship with them. It just takes time and it takes commitment on both sides. And over time, ideally, they'd be a permanent stakeholder in your system. But in a few cases, like I think we saw it in Minneapolis, St. Paul, and also in St. Louis and Philadelphia, they would work with one or two of their best performing bike share. They would eventually evolve into sort of a contract, or even without a contract, just an understanding that this was their preferred operator. They had a great relationship, and it stayed over the long term. So it is possible, but the complaints and grievances were much more readily apparent than the success stories. Next question, some companies are switching over to scooters, and if your town doesn't do scooters, they'll pull out entirely. Yes, that's true. There's one company in particular, I don't want to name names, but they've almost completely switched over to e-scooters, and they will allow you to have both in your community, but if you only want bicycles and don't want the scooters, they pull everything out entirely. And if that's the case, then the city should ask themselves, do they want to fight with such an organization, or go public with such information, or maybe just deal with one of the other 8 or 9 major providers out there that doesn't have that policy. But the attitude among the providers, the companies that run these programs, it seems to be that bicycles are fading away, either quickly or slowly, and they're investing more and more in the e-scooters. The current generation of e-scooters, it's a flimsy, small little thing, as I'm sure you've seen. They're developing and testing sturdier ones that you can sit on and ride for longer distances, or ones that are that have wider platforms to stand on, or bigger tires. So they're investing their own efforts in making e-scooters safer, because they believe that's the future and bike share is the past. So it might be difficult to get a company that agrees long-term just to do bicycles, and you may have to do an exclusive contract. But yeah, if a company puts that sort of pressure on a city, can you blame the city for letting them leave? The city gets to decide what they want on their streets or not. Next question, any examples of local groups creating their own community bike share systems? Other than, we've seen it a lot in Europe, and it may have happened in some of the smaller communities, for example, university towns that sort of fell below our cutoff point for checking. But from what we've seen in the literature about bike share programs and bike activism, a lot of that sort of thing where community members band together and maybe form a nonprofit or some sort of sharing program unofficially, it tends to occur in smaller communities, generally either in New England in the Northeast, or in parts of the Mountain West, smaller communities out west. But that may be a model that if a city can't find 1 or 2 providers that meet their needs and can perform as they expect, maybe they develop a task force and they come up with funds to purchase bicycles or rehabilitate old ones, and maybe a city can create their own. Maybe that's a great idea. I see no further questions. I apologize for the technical issues, and hopefully this has been of some help to you. It's the first time I've done one of these, so I hope it went well. Feel free to email me, and the contact information is here. This website is being recorded, this webinar is being recorded. We'll post it to YouTube shortly for future reference. In the meantime, you can contact myself or the rest of our staff through our communication channels here. We'd be happy to answer your questions. Oh, there is one more question before we go. Were any cities able to regulate successful first and last mile scenarios with the bike share companies? That, I think I've heard of pilot programs in a few cities that they're still working that out, but yes, I'm blanking on the cities that are doing it, but that is an option that's come up a few times. I want to say the main company that's working through those is it's the bike share program that's owned by Uber, which is Jump. And they're one of the larger providers jump, but they're transitioning over to e-scooters pretty aggressively. But they, just as Uber has been working with a lot of transit agencies to do first and last mile in Uber cars, they're also experimenting with bicycles and scooters in many places. But since I'm blanking on the cities that are trialing it, I would suggest checking with Uber/Jump to see which cities and markets they're active in testing that. But yeah, they're working with that mainly with scooters, but they still operate some bicycles, so I'm sure they're open to a bike share program. So then if that's the last question, I'm happy to have maybe provided some answers, some input here, and if you have any further questions, feel free to reach out. Thank you all for watching, and I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks.